The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this Fair Housing Laws and Regulations webinar. This webinar is part of the 2019 Maryland Realtors Webinar Thursday series and one of the free Maryland Realtor benefits. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website late next week. Our presenters this morning are Ms. Cheryl Frost Brown with the National Fair Housing Alliance and Ms. Shannon Darrow with the Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland. A bit about our presenters. Ms. Cheryl Frost Brown is the Vice President of Member Services and Community Development at the National Fair Housing Alliance. She has been in the fair housing field since 1996 and at NFHA since 2002. As Vice President of Member Services, she coordinates technical assistance to NFHA member organizations on education, enforcement, board development, and public policy. In 2010, Ms. Frost Brown began coordinating NFHA's National Housing Accessibility Partnership Program, which was created after the settlement of a national design and construction case. The HAP program provides grants to local and regional centers for independent living, fair housing centers, and affordable housing partners to retrofit homes and apartments for persons with disabilities. Shannon Darrow oversees the Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland education, investigation, and enforcement work in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance. Through outreach and training, she works to increase fair housing knowledge and appropriate applications of the laws. She provides advocacy to individuals who feel they may be victims of housing discrimination and conducts fair housing investigations, both client-based and systemic, to determine if unlawful discrimination may be occurring. During this presentation, your questions will be posted to the presenters anonymously. If you think of other questions later, you can contact our legal hotline at 800-888-1272. Please feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you, and let's begin.
Good morning. This is Cheryl Frost Brown from the National Fair Housing Alliance. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present and to speak with you. This is a follow-up to a March presentation or meeting that we had with a committee of the Maryland Board of Realtors, and so we're very thrilled to be asked to present to a larger group, and my colleague Shannon Darrow and I will do our best to share with you, based on our experience and the experience of other fair housing advocates around the country, some of the fair housing trends that we're seeing, as well as recap some of the laws and regulations that I'm sure many of you have heard before. We want to make this as participatory as possible. To that end, I encourage you to send in your questions via the chat feature, and we will use as many examples as we have available to us to expound on the various things that we'll talk about. I will begin by showing you a PowerPoint presentation that we have created to help guide this conversation today.
Okay. Hi, this is Shannon from the Fair Housing Action Center. I just want to give you a brief roadmap of some of the topics that we're going to be discussing during the webinar. We'll provide you with a brief history of fair housing laws. We'll discuss some trends that we've seen, particularly in terms of patterns of residential integration and segregation. We'll talk about sales issues in fair housing and the role of real estate agents. And then we'll talk about our campaign to fight housing-related hate activity. So I want to start by giving you a brief overview of key pieces of fair housing law. The first ever was the law of 1866. And this was something that was passed as part of a package of reforms following the Civil War, working to include formerly enslaved people as full citizens of the United States. And it says that such citizens of every race and color, without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, and give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. So this is the first ever attempt to create some fair housing guidelines. This refers specifically to race. One must be a citizen, and you do need to prove intent. Then we get to the passage of the Fair Housing Act, one of the most important civil rights laws passed in our nation. The context of this is the civil rights movement of the early and mid 1960s. And in addition to activists like Martin Luther King, there were also politicians who were very concerned about the state of opportunity for all people in our country. So President Johnson had asked Senators Brooke, and this is a Republican from Massachusetts, and Senators Mondale, a Democrat from Minnesota, to reintroduce the 1964 Open Housing Bill. It passed the House and Senate in 6 days and was signed into law in 1968, just 7 days following the assassination of Martin Luther King. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, of color, national origin or religion, sex or gender was added later. And there are a couple limitations to the law as it was initially passed. One is there was a cap on damages. People who were discriminated against could only receive $1,000 to make them whole. And the second thing is that HUD had no real authority. So it was a strong bill on paper, but there wasn't really any enforcement capacity within HUD itself. And then in 1988, we see some amendments, some really key amendments that strengthen the Fair Housing Act. One is the limit on punitive damages was removed. It increased HUD and the Department of Justice in their enforcement authority and created some funding to help nonprofit groups work to educate and enforce this law. But most importantly, it added 2 new protected classes. One is families with children, and the other is people with disabilities. And the addition of people with disabilities is really key. One of the things that we see in looking at the types of discrimination complaints that we respond to is over half involve people with disabilities. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader context of what we're seeing in our communities in terms of patterns of residential segregation and integration. A lot of people are aware that the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination. That law, as passed in 1968, actually has a second set of goals. And those goals were to dismantle patterns of residential segregation based on race and ethnicity and create mobility and opportunity for all people. So what you're looking at here, this is a map of demographic patterns in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And what you see are dense concentrations of minority communities, as well as areas that still are almost entirely white. There's a public health scholar named Dr. Lawrence Brown, and in talking about racial patterns and histories of segregation in the Baltimore area, he talks about something called the white L and the black butterfly. And that's really important because a lot of times what we see are amenities being concentrated in areas that are majority white rather than majority people of color. And there are a number of reasons why a map could look this way. There are a lot of factors that could be at play. Certainly, some of that could be choice. People choosing where to live, people wanting to be near people, be near family, be near social networks. But what we see and what we understand from the research that we do and the interactions that we have with members of our communities is that discrimination is still happening. And that can occur within the housing industry, from real estate agents continuing to engage in what's called racial steering. That can also happen and does happen in terms of lending and financing, looking at where banks are approving mortgages and where they're not. And I do want to talk a little bit beyond. They have a couple more maps of some of the suburban jurisdictions. So this is Anne Arundel County. As you can see, this one is broken out looking at concentrations of African Americans in Anne Arundel County, and also concentrations of Latinos, Latinas. And again, it's a similar story. You see dense concentrations in the northern county and in Annapolis. And then not a lot of people of color living throughout the county, countywide. And then there's also some stories. So this actually kind of makes it pop a little bit more. As you can see, there's that strong border between Anne Arundel and Prince George's County, where it makes kind of the racial concentration within our suburban counties a lot more visible. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about changes over time. So this is Howard County in 1990, and it looks at where whites, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans live. And we picked Howard County for a couple important reasons. One is it is one of the wealthiest counties in the entire country. A lot of opportunities, really strong schools, a lot of amenities. It's a very desirable place for a lot of people and families to live. Secondly, there's actually a very interesting case study of fair housing and building communities to promote integration. I don't know if folks are familiar with Columbia, Maryland. It's a planned community in the 1960s that was built around the idea of bringing people of different backgrounds together to live in a strong neighborhood with lots of opportunities. So this is Howard County in 2000. And you see two things happening, and these are going to repeat throughout the next several slides. One is you see the number of people of color in the county overall increasing fairly dramatically. The second thing is that you see, although the demographics are shifting and the county is becoming much more racially diverse, there's still segregation going on. And this is the final map. This is Howard County. This is 2016, but pretty much how it looks today. And I'm going to turn it over. Oh.
I'm here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to, before I get into some discussion about the role of a real estate agent in the various transactions that you do, I just want to give you just a brief synopsis of who the National Fair Housing Alliance is. We are an umbrella group for fair housing centers around the country, including the Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland that Shannon is associated with. We provide education and outreach materials for the public as well as for members and municipal offices. These are available free. You can customize them for your offices or for your business location as you wish. We also have a compliance department that works with housing providers in making sure that you're complying with fair housing laws. And we have several other departments, including the two that I help to coordinate. And of course, we have an enforcement and investigations department that provide assistance to individuals, but more likely to our members and others when they believe they've been discriminated against in their search for housing in any of the areas that they're looking, whether to rent, to purchase, to get home insurance, a loan for their home, get their home inspected or appraised. So this slide is titled, What's an Agent to Do? Throughout the work of the National Fair Housing Alliance and its members, we have looked at the role of the agent or the broker or the housing provider, but particularly since we're talking with real estate agents or folks involved in the sales department, we want to just bring to your attention that you have a very vital role in working to further the fair housing mandate that is the policy of the country. So for instance, during the listing, if a seller asks you to not show their home to someone, a buyer who may be a person of color, may be of a different religion, may be a family with kids, and they give you a reason such as they don't want to just bother their neighbors, they don't want to be the first one to bring someone different to the neighborhood, what is your role? This is your livelihood. You want to have the business. Well, because the fair housing law impacts your livelihood as well, it is your role to explain in a very nice way that you have to comply with various laws during your business. And it would be good for you to just remind them. I'm hoping that you've had a discussion before you receive the listing to let them know you're going to do the very best to get them the best, most qualified, eligible buyer for their home, but that you're doing this in compliance with all the rules and regulations that govern your business. However, if a seller mandates that you not show their home to particular groups of people who are protected by federal or state or local laws, then you are also a victim of housing discrimination. You could lose that listing and you could lose the income that comes from that. I want to just recommend that you view their housing organizations as a resource as well. You can anonymously let them know about what's happening in your business. We can do investigations that also allow you to recover your damages and your loss, because you do not want to be the agent that is perpetuating either housing segregation or unfair housing practices. When Shannon and I met in March with the committee in Annapolis there, we had a conversation about pocket listings. And while pocket listings in and of themselves are not a discriminatory practice, they do limit the ability for a larger audience to know about available housing. Pocket listings remove housing opportunities for people primarily in protected groups from seeing the home. You have, by not listing in the MLS or in any way advertising an available home, you are limiting, and you could run the risk of denying the home to someone based on race or some other protected category. So it's something to discuss in your brokerage firm to come up with a policy as to what is your practice when there's a pocket listing. And it's all about not limiting the opportunity for as broad as possible a base to see and have access to available housing. The role of a real estate agent during the housing search. We have received over 30 years complaints or have heard anecdotally from agents who say that they have run into challenges with scheduling appointments once they have a qualified buyer. We have asked for more information, and we've done our own investigations and have found that sometimes the reason why there are challenges in getting appointments may not be as objective as the explanation that you may receive. Sometimes it could be based on the race of the perceived buyer of the home or the race of the agent showing the home. That is a fair housing issue, and it's one that needs to be further investigated so that you do not lose the business and so that you do not perpetuate violating the law. Sometimes there's an issue with scheduling due to neighbor involvement. For instance, you may have brought prospective buyers to see this home, and then the seller or the HOA or someone there who has seen you and has seen the buyers, the potential buyers that are coming through the open house or coming to see the available home will start to make calls to your agency or to the homeowner who is selling to say, I do not wish to have those people coming through. If that is, again, an issue that is preventing you from showing available homes or apartments, if you also work in the rental field, to available home seekers, that is a fair housing issue. The role of the agent during offers. This sometimes occurs when a seller asks for more information about the buyer than is available on the paperwork that you have for them. They may ask about the race or the national origin or the religion of the buyers. Sometimes some agents may have letters. We call them, there are different names for these letters, where the buyers wanting to make themselves more attractive to the seller will provide buyers explaining why they will provide letters explaining why they love the house or should get it. And that can be controversial. So I would again ask that you talk within your brokerage firms as to what your policy is about this, because it runs the potential of violating fair housing laws if the reason for selecting a buyer or for asking for more information about a buyer is about the buyer's race or national origin, the presence of children, or their religion, or some other protected basis. This is a business transaction, and it should really be done around the price and availability and other financial decisions and needs. The role of the agent post-sale. Shannon mentioned earlier about our Fight Hate campaign. That has been an ongoing campaign since the 9/11 occurred, and even before, but it really increased following 9/11. And we have noted following the 2016 election that there has been an increase in housing-related hate crimes. What do I mean by that? The role of the real estate agent does not end at the closing. A good real estate agent follows up to make sure that the buyer remains satisfied, answer any post-sale question, and it's really good customer service. But if in your post-sale or post-rental contact with your clients, you're hearing about harassment or complaints or issues with others in the neighborhood that is related to the buyer's race or national origin or disability or religion or some other protected basis, I would ask that you recommend that they speak with the local fair housing center, or if it is a criminal issue such as vandalism or someone damaging their property, that they do make a complaint to a police office, or if it's more serious, to the FBI. The National Fair Housing Alliance has a booklet and some other materials that we've made available to our members and to anyone who wants them about how you create a corporate or an office culture dealing with any kind of housing-related hate activity. The role of the real estate agent is as a partner with all of us in the fair housing advocacy movement. The fair housing laws is the law of our country. So when we look at what the role of the agent is in, for instance, the loan origination, are the terms and conditions and the rates and down payments, do those change when you make referrals to a mortgage lender? Do the rates and terms and conditions change based on a protected basis of the buyer? If there are different rates or if there's a different terms and conditions, or if a loan agent keeps losing your client's documents and it's related to your client's race or religion or some other protected basis, it is worth checking out if that is a fair housing issue. We also look at appraisals. We look to see where homes are appraising differently, either based on the racial or ethnic composition of the neighborhood or even of the buyer. And if our investigation shows that that is a reason, then we're going to look not just at the appraiser, but how the homeowner, how the customer came into contact with that appraisal firm. And if that appraisal firm is someone that you use regularly, then that could be problematic for you and your brokerage firm. How the fair housing law is crafted, it holds everyone accountable for the violation of the Fair Housing Act. We regularly do investigations looking at insurance. How that affects you in your business is we look to see if insurance agents that could be recommended by the brokerage or agency, do they regularly charge a higher premium for certain neighborhoods or for certain home buyers based on a protected class. We do understand that there are criteria that must be taken into consideration, but we look to make sure that each person is given is being treated fairly when they go to get home insurance, because you need that to close on your home. And again, looking at the closing transactions, we look to see that the loan terms are not changing based again on a protected category of the home purchaser. We look to see if the agency or the brokerage firm is requiring specific title company. What is the relationship with the title company? Is this a title company that treats everyone who comes to them in a fair manner under the law? So one of the issues that we're asked about, and as we were preparing to do this presentation, we were told that there are many questions around advertising versus staring. It is important in the line of business that you do that you advertise. Our recommendation is that your advertisement is limited, or at least, or best practice is that you describe the property, the dwelling, the housing, rather than giving suggestions as to whom the housing is good, quote unquote, good for. Staring refers to the practice of recommending homes in particular neighborhoods or particular areas based on what the buyer's race, perceived race, or any protected basis is, or based on what you believe that neighborhood or those neighbors, the type of buyers that you wish them to see. Here's a question that we received prior to doing this webinar. Is describing a listing as being in a grade school district staring? It just may be. The National Fair Housing Alliance a few years ago did an investigation that included Maryland and New York and several other states, where we found that schools were being used as a proxy for race. So the agents that were contacted by the home buyers would not say, you don't wish to live in this neighborhood because of race or national origin, but they would rather say that, oh, this home is in a good school district. And that would be told to one home buyer, and the next home buyer, who would more likely be a white home buyer, was told, this home is not in a good school district. I think you should leave the differentiation or the rating of school districts to the school district, and refer your home buyers when they ask you about school districts to the schools that are there, or have them do their own research about schooling. Regarding the Mrs. Murphy's exemption and whether or not that is potentially discriminatory, I will say that if the home is being sold by a licensed agent, it is not covered by the Mrs. Murphy's exemption. And there may be other issues with that where you may lose the Mrs. Murphy's exemption. For instance, if there is in that advertisement a direct statement that is discriminatory, you could lose that Mrs. Murphy's exemption. As Shannon addressed earlier, most of the complaints that we're getting are around disability, and a lot of them are around addressing reasonable accommodation requests. ESA stands for Emotional Support Animals. I would say no, you cannot, and the law, both the American with Disabilities Act as well as the Fair Housing Act, is very, very specific in saying you cannot charge a pet fee if the animal is not a pet. If the animal is one that serves a function for the individual with a disability, there needs to be a relationship between the person asking for the disability and the animal that they have. What do they do to help that individual remain independent? You cannot charge a pet fee there. Renting to housing choice voucher or Section 8 recipients. Here is another area in which you need to know what is covered in your local jurisdictions. If housing choice voucher is covered under the source of income protection, then yes, you do have to accept it. I will say that there is currently a lot of conversation around housing choice voucher as a part of source of income. I also know that throughout Maryland, the state, there are different counties that covers or are considering legislation to cover the acceptance of housing choice voucher. In the fair housing field, we're looking even further. What is behind the reticence of not accepting a voucher? And we are looking at a theory that is called disparate impact, where a policy or a law currently is not discriminatory on its face, but how it is applied impacts a protected class. Who are the folks, the families, most likely to have a voucher? It is someone with a disability, it is a family with children, and yes, it is persons who are African American or some other non-white race. But if you have a blanket policy that you're not accepting a voucher, we may do an investigation to make sure that the reason, or to investigate the reason behind why that is not being accepted, especially if that housing is in an area that currently does not have a voucher policy. The issue around citizenship. Now, the 1866 law was very specific about citizenship, but we're also looking at the Fair Housing Act, which does not have a citizenship clause. So again, I would say look at the business justification for not conducting business or transactions with persons who are non-citizens. This last year in Virginia, there was a decision by the Fourth Circuit in Reyes versus Wapples, which held that a mobile home park, by requesting or mandating that every applicant for their housing in their park be a citizen, the court in Virginia held that that was a violation, it was a disparate impact case, and that it was an attempt by the housing provider there to avoid renting, in this case, to Latino or persons of Hispanic origin. I want to touch on three types of investigations or areas that we're looking at in fair housing. Real estate owned transactions. This exploded following the crash of the housing market in 2007, 2008. And the National Fair Housing Alliance and 19 of our members throughout the country did investigations to see if real estate owned homes in areas that are majority Black or African American, Latino, or some mixed areas were being treated the same way as homes that were foreclosed in majority white area. Our investigation showed that the marketing, the maintenance, the ability for all agents, both those who are African American, Latinos, white, all agents to have access to those opportunities was not fair. We filed several complaints against Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Fannie Mae, and its asset managers such as Safeguard, several of which are continuing to go through the courts right now. But we find that what happened after the market was not being, the real estate owned transactions were not being fairly applied or fairly marketed or fairly maintained. Earlier this year, we settled an agreement with Facebook about their housing platforms, which were violating the law, we felt, because they were allowing folks who had housing for rent or for sale. The housing platforms were allowing home providers to limit who had access to available homes. So I would say, as you're looking at expanding your business and using Facebook and social media, to explore and ensure that what you're advertising on social media meets with fair housing advertising and other regulations. We're also looking at the reemergence of contract for deeds transactions, rent to lease or rent to own transactions, because we're seeing in areas where the market hasn't completely rebounded, we're seeing where primarily investors have purchased up a lot of the foreclosed homes and have gone back to types of transactions that, had died away with, in violating the law by entering into these kinds of transactions. We're looking at the Fair Housing Act protections and how fair housing organizations and advocates can assist folks who have entered into these transactions. So I just bring that to your attention just to let you know. This is a map which just goes back to our real estate owned investigations, which just gives you a snapshot of one of our investigations. The green dots are where we found 0 to 4 deficiencies in the maintenance or marketing of foreclosed homes between 2010 and 2017. As you can see, the majority of green dots are in areas that are 0, and I'm sorry that the legend is not as clear on this slide, but the areas that are white are areas that are 0 to 49% white. The areas that are darker are 50 to 100% African American, mixed, or Latino communities. And you'll see that the majority of green dots are in areas where those foreclosures had very few deficiencies or marketing issues. The red are where there are 10 or more deficiencies, and the yellow is where there's 5 to 9 deficiencies. And those were clustered primarily in, as we're looking in Prince George's County, in particular communities. And yes, there were some green dots there. When we expand this further to look at block and census tract, those may be homes that are in areas that are undergoing change. But this gives us a snapshot of why we feel that the real estate owned REO transactions were worthy to be looked at for fair housing issues. And I'll turn it back over to Shannon to talk a little bit about testing and investigations.
Great, thank you so much. So throughout this presentation, Cheryl has talked a lot about one of the main things that fair housing centers do is investigations. One of the main tools or methods that we use to investigate claims of discrimination is testing. So that is where you would send people out, usually in a matched pair, where one person would be white, one would be a person of color, or you could look at a single person with no children versus a single parent with children. You can structure the tests in different ways to get a sense of how people with different characteristics and that would fall under different protected classes are being treated when they're interacting with the housing market. It could be rental market, it could be sales, or it could be lending. So one of the things that it's really helpful and that testing is a really useful tool for uncovering are trends. Some of them are looking at whether steering, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, is still happening. Where are white prospective buyers being shown homes versus where African American and Latino prospective buyers are being shown homes. And we've seen through testing that we've done is that still a persistent problem. Also, as we think about different ways in which our neighborhoods are changing, looking at how steering may be fostering gentrification, whether if a neighborhood is being reinvested in, are white buyers being shown certain blocks, are buyers of color being shown other blocks. Family status is also really key with that. How are families with children of the same race being treated and being shown homes, and what areas are they being targeted towards? Also, too, fair housing laws protect everybody. Looking at are white people being discouraged from living in more integrated communities or communities that are majority people of color? And are agents refusing to list in communities because of the racial demographics or because of other characteristics or assumptions about the community? And one of the things that Cheryl talked a bit about was a theory called disparate impact, which is where a policy appears neutral and isn't necessarily discriminatory, but does have a disparate impact on groups that are protected by the Fair Housing Act. And one of the places where we see this is agents or companies refusing to list or show homes based on the assessed value of the property, or reluctance or reticence to work with low and moderate income buyers. We understand that you're in business, and that these are business transactions, but you do want to be careful that you're not violating the law in those types of interactions. Also, testing, as Cheryl mentioned, is something that a group can be hired to do in terms of compliance monitoring. So that is if your agency suspects that there might be something untoward going on or something illegal going on, compliance testing can verify that your staff are complying with the law. And finally, testing, just one last thing. Testing is used to verify individual complaints and often provides the evidence that is used when filing with HUD or when litigating an individual claim of discrimination. I'm going to turn it back over to Cheryl. She's going to talk in a little bit more depth about some really key court cases that have shaped fair housing law and the practice.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. And I'm not going to take too long because I want to leave the last couple of minutes for any additional questions that folks may have. So here are a few cases that we highlight for you if you've not seen them before. The Traficante case is out of California. It's a rental case. It is where a white renter, among others, sued the housing provider, the apartment owner and management company because of their actions. The actions of the management company was perpetuating segregation in that rental community. They were denying applicants who were not white, and this particular renter joined with others in filing suit that went all the way to the Supreme Court, which held that, one, as Shannon mentioned, white folks are protected by the Fair Housing Act, but it also held on the fact that this particular tenant complained that they were deprived of the opportunity to live in an integrated community by the actions of the management company and the owners. And the Supreme Court upheld that that was covered under the Fair Housing Act, and the case proceeded with damages. Havens Realty is a Virginia complaint that also went to the Supreme Court. It held that testers and fair housing centers had standing, which means that based on their actions and their activities in investigating and advocating and educating their communities, that they had standing, that they could bring a complaint under the Fair Housing Act, that it is not limited to just individual home buyers or renters who are truly seeking to rent or to purchase the home. The Matchmaker case is out of Chicago. It deals with a broker's responsibility or liability, rather, for the actions of the agents that are in their brokerage firm. The broker was held liable for the steering and the fair housing violations that their agent allegedly conducted. NAFA versus Coldwell Banker is one of our recent sales investigation. It also went, well, not to the Supreme Court, but it was filed with HUD, and then DOJ took the case. When we gave them information, well, after it went through HUD, it was found that the agents didn't, in fact, violate the law, and so DOJ took the case over. I want to point out here that that was in the past few years. It was very eye-opening for us as advocates because we were told that, oh, this no longer happens, agents are not staring. But I'll give you an example of what came out of our investigation. The tester had contacted the agents at this firm. The particular agent would only speak with white testers, and when our tester went to meet with them to be shown homes, the agent said to the tester, I couldn't tell what you were over the phone, so I made 2 sets of listings. We are obviously not going to need this set, and proceeded to show the white tester only homes in white neighborhoods. And all the black testers who contacted that agent were shown homes in areas that were predominantly black. And there were comments made. USA Remax is also another one of our investigations. It's out of Chicago. It is a repeat offender, unfortunately, because the agent spoke and made comments to our testers and spoke about a previous complaint that was filed against him. The essence of it is that he lost his license in addition to causing his brokerage firms a lot of money. Goddard versus, and I'm not going to try to pronounce this, name is a case out of Arizona. A Black doctor wished to purchase a $500,000 lot, and he was denied because the sellers refused to have the lot being sold to someone who was not white, because it was in a very remote area, a very beautiful area, and the sellers also would have been neighbors to the new home buyer. And so in this instance, the buyer's agent was going to lose quite a bit of funds. They joined the complaint, and the Arizona AG's office handled the complaint, and it was resolved to both the buyer's agent and the buyer's satisfaction. So I just want to bring those to your attention. One, agents are covered under the Fair Housing Act, and there are many more. One last one that I didn't put up here is one, it's very old, it's over 40 years. It's called the Pinchback case. It's from Maryland. It's one that BNI handled, and it deals with what we call the futile gesture, where a sales agent said to a home buyer, an actual complainant, I'm not going to show you any homes in this development because it is well known, they've said, they're not going to rent or sell to anyone who is Black. And that was also a case that was decided for the complainant. And finally, I just want to reiterate that the Fair Housing Act has there are two pieces to it. One is the elimination of housing discrimination, but the second part of the Fair Housing Act is the promotion of integrated and inclusive communities. And I thank you. And I hope that there's still a couple of minutes left for one or two questions, if there are any.
Hi there, Cheryl. So I have two questions here. One question is, are there maps for Southern Maryland in regards to this?
We don't currently have, but if I can find out from our staff here to do some maps of Southern Maryland. We just did not have the resource to go further into Maryland, but we can certainly look into that and share those in a follow-up with you. Okay. And if you could send me specific communities that you'd like me to look at, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay. If a home does not comply with people with disabilities, who has to correct the issue?
Are you speaking, I need to know a little bit more about this. Are you speaking about a home that's being rented or a home that has been sold? And if it's a home that is being rented, and we're talking about the physical home is not accessible, the general rule is that the person with a disability, if it's not a home that has any kind of federal or government funding, the cost of making the modifications or retrofit would be borne by the individual with disabilities. If it's a home that has been sold, that should have been discussed in the transaction, and so I'd need to know more about that. And just in general, when we look at disability complaints, they are very fact-specific and very case-specific. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer or remedy. We have to look at what the person with disability needs to make them more independent and all the issues around it.
Okay, a seller would not look at offers from members from a particular church. Is this discriminatory?
Particular church? Again, I'd want to know, is this is this the home being offered, is it church owned? Because there is some exemptions for religious reasons, but not generally, because then that could be considered discrimination based on religion. And religion, again, you don't have to have a definite religious. You could be someone who does not believe in any kind of religion, and you are protected by the Fair Housing Act as well. So again, I'd want to know a little bit more about the transaction to give a definitive answer. And I know I didn't say this earlier. I am not an attorney. I'm an advocate.
Okay, and for that question, the person said that it is not church-owned.
If the house is not church-owned and the person is saying, I'm not going to sell to someone because they're of a different religion, they are running. I would want to look further into that under a possible violation of the Fair Housing Act based on religion. I'd want to look into that, yes.
Okay, does a rental house have to be painted every time a renter moves out?
That depends. It depends on the condition of the house. And it really does depend. How long has that tenant lived in the house prior to moving out? What is the condition of the house? What were the lease terms and conditions that both sides entered into? So yeah, it would depend on everything. I'd want to see the lease agreement that was signed by both parties, and of course there is some leeway for normal wear and tear.
Okay, after extensively explaining the fair housing laws to a seller and he or she has refused to let a protected class see the property, what do you do as an agent? Refuse the listing or make a complaint? The tenant has, oh, that's another question. Go ahead.
I think that is something, my preference would be that agent documents what happened. So it's not just a he said, she said. If you're not the broker, that you also report that to your broker, because I'm sure there is some agreement between the agent and the broker. And yes, as an advocate, I would not accept that listing, but I would also file a complaint, because you stand to lose your business, whatever the amount is. Your business income or your brokerage stands to lose the income as well. If the refusal is completely based on the fact of the buyer's race or any other protected category, it has nothing to do with them being able to afford to purchase the property.
I have a comment here. Someone said that they are not fully clear on your comments on the housing choice vouchers.
So housing choice vouchers is a government program that provides payment to a housing provider a certain amount. It could be the entire amount, or it could be 70% of the rental amount. My comments earlier were that to just have a blanket policy that I'm not renting to Section 8 tenants or persons with housing choice voucher in and of itself may not be discriminatory. However, if your local jurisdiction has a protection that says, a law that says housing choice vouchers, Section 8 is covered, and you said, I'm not renting to anyone who has a housing choice voucher or a Section 8, then you are violating that law, 1. 2, and where probably I confuse folks, is the fact that housing advocates are looking at this overall refusal, whether you are covered by a local law or not, the refusal of not accepting Section 8, we're looking at it from a disparate impact standpoint. Housing choice guarantee, the housing choice voucher guarantees a certain amount of funding to the housing provider, the landlord or agent. So there is that guaranteed income stream once you've started the program. But the majority of cases that we hear, why folks don't want to rent to the folks, we're going to look to see, is it because of the race of the individual with the voucher, or the presence of children, or because the individual has a disability. So it has nothing to do with the government payment or the challenges with getting the house approved and the payment structure started. But it really has to do with this housing provider saying, I really don't want people with disabilities or persons with children or persons who are African American or Latino or some other race. So we're looking at it, one, is it protected? If it's protected, then you're definitely in violation. If it's not protected, then we're going to dig deeper to see why there is that refusal and see if there's a fair housing issue there.
Okay, what is the difference between a regular housing voucher and a veterans housing voucher?
I am not very, I don't have enough information or knowledge with the veterans voucher, except to say that they're reserved primarily for veterans. But beyond that, I truly don't have a lot of information.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, at this time, it doesn't seem like we have any more questions, and we're going to wrap the webinar up. We'd like to thank you, Ms. Cheryl and Shannon, for this webinar today.
Thank you, too.
Thank you.